Hi, Amber.
Hi, Chewy.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Doing okay.
Doing okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, I know we know each other pretty well, but for this interview, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, sure. So, my name is Amber Smock, and my pronouns are she and her. And I am the director of advocacy for Access Living. What that means is that I supervise a team that oversees, that does policy and community organizing focused on people with all kinds of disabilities. And we work out of our home base on Chicago Avenue, Access Living. And so our primary goal is to serve people with disabilities in Chicago. But we do a lot of advocacy, not just in Chicago, but also at the state level and at the national level as well. So we do all kinds of community organizing work, try to talk with policymakers to remove barriers for people with disabilities. We do a lot of communication to try to educate people about different kinds of issues. And so we do that work. And I've been the director of advocacy since 2010. So this is my almost 11th anniversary as director of advocacy. I started at Access Living in 2005. So I worked at Access Living for 16 years. And my first job at Access Living was as a community organizer focusing on young people with disabilities. So that's how I got my start with community organizing and disability.
Thank you. Um, what have been the changes that you have seen in our community?
So can you elaborate a little bit more on that question? Like what
Like,
kinds of changes do you want me to focus on?
like, in our disability rights community, you've been around for quite a while, more than I have. So, um, I know you have seen different changes, like the movement keeps it evolving in the
Mhm.
way that some of us don't get used to it, or there's new terminology when it comes to disabilities.
Mhm.
So, what have you seen that has improved and needs improvement?
Okay. Okay. So when I started at Access Living back in 2005, I think that the disability rights movement was still very much about disability rights. And at that time, there were starting to be people that came together that said we need to look at a different way of making sure that the needs of people with disabilities are met. And we need to look at different ways of addressing not just structural ableism, but structural racism, homophobia, xenophobia, etc. And it's really important to recognize that folks with disabilities live with multiple experiences at the same time. So for example, we're talking about, yes, somebody might have a disability and a very specific kind of disability. Maybe they have many disabilities, but their gender also matters, their race also matters, LGBT status matters, etc. So I think around that time, that's when some folks came together and developed the concept of disability justice. And so during the time that I've been involved with the disability movement, disability rights has kept doing work, but disability justice has grown immensely. And I think that it took a new leap when we had the Great Recession in 2008. And that led to Occupy, and then a lot of people with disabilities started getting involved. And the movement, because of Occupy, and starting to connect the dots. And I think that's where I first met you. And then after 2008, and then Occupy, a lot of people were looking at, okay, so how do we, at least in Illinois, how do we address problems of lack of funding? How do we address the institutional bias? You know, um, and then, but then came 2012 and the shooting, the murder of Trayvon Martin, right? And what started happening at that time is I think disability justice started growing even more because the national conversation about Black Lives Matter and about racial justice just started growing even more. And then we also saw folks with disabilities encountering policymakers who were doing bad things for people with disabilities. So I know in Illinois, we were dealing with an administration, the Monroe administration, that was really negative for people with disabilities. And then in the middle of the Monroe administration, we also saw Trump get elected, right? And so we all just got through 4 very, very, very long years of Trump. Um, but I would say that, especially starting in under the leadership of the Obama administration disability folks in the early 2010s, I think we also started seeing a lot more encouragement and growth and development of supporting Black and Brown disabled people. And we started seeing more mentoring, and people started picking up more skills and started their own project and building. And among those things, I would also say that people started getting more involved in understanding how folks with disabilities can run for office, how people with disabilities can have a say in public agendas, how people with disabilities can make a difference in voting. I think we've seen a lot of growth in that way. So at the same time, I would say I think that there are a lot of folks with disabilities that have grown. What I want to say is probably healing justice for the disability community, right? And not just the disability community, but all communities. And I think there's been an emphasis on mutual aid and not just your legal rights as a person with a disability, but building the kinds of communities that people want to live in and that people want to be a part of. And I think we have, like any movement, over the course of time, encountered big struggles within our movement and outside our movement. Who gets to be in charge, right? And who gets to have the money? And who gets to lead so and so? And I do think that at this point in time, compared to 2005 when I started, uh, I think that there are more people with disabilities acknowledging the problems of structural racism within the disability movement, but also broader, right? I think that there are more people who are committed to anti-racist efforts and have a better understanding of what that's supposed to be. I think people still have a lot to learn, but I think that we're in a much better position than we were in 2005. 2005 feels like a million years ago. And I mean, I just, like, I look back at what I was doing then, and I think about how much I didn't know at that time. And some of what I've learned since then, people have been great about helping me learn. Sometimes I've had to learn by making mistakes. And sometimes I made mistakes just because I was ignorant of what the issues at stake might be. So gaining experience in that way is really hard, but it is important. And what I think is that if there are disability organizations or disability groups now that are not actively working on, anti-racism and immigration and dealing with LGBT issues, if you're not actively working on that, I mean, you're really not paying attention, because I think that the memo has been put out there. And, sometimes people have a hard time listening. Okay. But the fact is that at this point, the urge, like the need for people to do better, that is now known. People know they need to do better. And right now, people really are in the position of either you make the choice to do better, or you're actually making the choice not to do better if you're not changing anything. So I think that there's a lot of flux right now. I also think that we don't know what's coming next. And I think that even though, yes, Trump is not the president anymore, and Biden is now the president. Every president comes with pros and cons. Every president is going to face choices that will make people happy or not make people happy. But, Biden notwithstanding, I think we also have to deal with the fact that, there's obviously increasingly active, like, white domestic terrorism going on, and trying to get ready for that and making sure that we're strong enough for it and that we're able to hold people involved in that accountable. That's a challenge. And I don't feel like I have good advice about this right now. All I know is that we need to do our best to teach each other. We need to do our best to bring people together so that when it, push comes to shove, we can push back. And Chewy, honestly, I think that a different issue that's been made clear by the pandemic and by climate change is like we have to figure out this problem of how do we survive on this planet, not just for the next 10 years, but maybe the next 20 to 30 years. Are people supposed to make their homes? And what kind of resources do people get to be resilient if something happens to your home because of climate change or something else, right? So I think that people are starting to do that work, and it's baby steps, but that too has to be done in a way where if we can just catch where we are repeating patterns of structural racism, structural ableism, we need to avoid that as much as possible. So I feel like we're living in a time of great change, to be honest.
You're absolutely right. Um, so I see that you're using a ASL interpreter. Speak to me about your disability and um, how has it made you grow as a person, and how would you encourage others who also um, also have to use ASL?
Okay. So, uh, so I am deaf, and something that people need to understand, I think, is that deaf people come in a lot of different forms. So you will have deaf people that use sign language. You will have deaf people that don't. You will have deaf people that don't talk. You have deaf people that do. You have deaf people who are easily understood, and then you have deaf people who are very difficult to understand. So every deaf or hard of hearing person is a little bit different. Um, so uh, my parents found out that I had hearing loss when I was a little kid, right? So about 3.5. And when I was going to school, I wore hearing aids. I read it up. I had to sit at the front of the class. I had an IEP for speech therapy, so I did speech therapy for a bunch of years. And but there's only so far you can go with communication to the point where, okay, you've learned all the therapy, you've done all the practices, but there's not much more to go because there's not enough technology and knowledge for it. So I stopped doing therapy and that sort of thing in middle school. But it wasn't until college that technology really started coming forward that would basically change my life. So when we first started seeing beepers being used as text devices, that was a game changer, big game changer. And also the establishment of the video relay system, deaf people being able to make phone calls with the support of ASL interpreter, that was a game changer too. And then, these days, obviously, we have all kinds of new voice to text apps and all kinds of digital devices that help us receive communication in ways that we didn't before. But to be honest, I think the thing that people might not understand about communication access is what it's like not to have communication access and what it's like to be, especially for little children, deprived of language. Between the ages of 0 and 5, it's really important that kids develop their language skills. And if they don't have access to any language, whether it's signing or speaking, that's a big problem. And I know that there are a lot of deaf advocates who are making it a point to advocate to make sure that every deaf and hard of hearing kid has access to language as early as possible. So so when you don't have language or you have limited access to communication, it's so hard to do so many of the things we need to do to just do our lives, right? If you don't have communication access, you have to deal with school, healthcare, family relationships, being able to work, etc. And with communication access, what happens is you can be going along, having a great day, doing your thing, and then the communication access disappears, and it's like a door slammed in your face. But I have to say that feeling of having the door slammed in your face and you're totally helpless to do anything about it at the moment, that's very common for a lot of disability discrimination experiences, right? So maybe you have that door slam feeling if you use a wheelchair. Maybe you have that door slam feeling if you're blind, right? But that feeling of this just happened to me out of my control, I could do nothing about it, is a horrible feeling. And for me, it makes me feel like I just want to throw things, right? And so trying to work through that is an ongoing struggle. And, honestly, when you have been fighting for access day after day, year after year, you sometimes get tired. Sometimes it's like, well, you know what? I want to go to that thing, but it's not accessible. And I just don't have the energy to fight for access today. I'll fight it for another thing tomorrow. So sometimes you do have to pick your battles. But the main thing is that I also appreciate that being deaf allows me a door into a community, right? It allows me a door into the deaf world, but it also allows me a connection with people with other kinds of disabilities. And so the great thing about recognizing and naming and owning your deafness or your disability status is that it opens up these new worlds of people that you never would have known otherwise, right? And being involved with access living, being involved with other people with disabilities, there are things that I have done that I am sure I would never have done if I didn't have exposure to the disability community. So it's really pretty amazing. For people who are younger or people from the deaf community that I want to encourage, I actually right now I'm in the process of mentoring two deaf organizers through a program designed for deaf and disabled Jewish community members. And so I'm mentoring them on a monthly basis. And some of the things we talk about are not just how to identify power and how to bring people together, but also how do we look at other people and see their potential? What is it that you're looking for in another person to bring out their potential? Can you name it? And being able to do that and look at people and support their potential, that is so important. And that's something that I want to encourage other deaf and disabled organizers to really think about is when you think about leadership and you think about people that have the potential to do more, like what are those qualities? And can you tell them that you see it? And can you help them grow? That's a really big important part of this work. So that's some of the stuff that I'm doing right now with encouraging future leaders. Just one example.
Can you tell me some of your visions that you hope to see in the future for our community?
Yeah. So in the future, I think that I would like to see more disability community members be able to understand what it means to share space and support each other. I think that's something that's always been needed. I know that we work on it, but I think that there's a lot more to do. Um, I also would like to see more. I don't know. I think that there are so many people with unrealized potential as disability advocates, and finding ways to bring them together and talk about what the opportunities are is really important. All the different things that are coming up, how can we fight more on economic justice? How can we fight more on climate change, right? We have to build the base to be able to engage on all those things. It can't be the same 20 to 30 people working on disability advocacy all the time, right? So we have to expand that circle of disability leaders. And we have to be prepared for the fact that that means that maybe organizations or groups have to change and adjust, right? But we have to keep making room for more people. And I think we need to look at people with disabilities who might not be working or doing things that are typically connected with advocacy, right? So, for example, some of the kinds of people that would be really important to grow is if you have more people with disabilities who are in the transportation industry. And we talk about accessible transportation and we advocate on accessible transportation. And there are a lot of writers that talk about accessible transportation. But what about the people who work in transportation and who have disabilities? How can we support those people to realize their potentials as leaders within transportation to push for inclusive, accessible transportation, right? So, really thinking about like who is out there who has a disability, who maybe just needs that organizing touch to realize their potential as an advocate, you know? Chewy, have you ever heard of there's a poem I think about advocacy I'm sorry, about organizing. There's a poem that talks about organizing that says that an organizer's touch makes the dad walk. Have you heard that before?
No.
But do you know what I'm talking about? You know, when you're organizing people and you help somebody realize something very powerful about themselves, that is that organizer's touch. You're making the dad walk, so to speak, or well, whichever one it works. But trying to activate people, that's a skill. And so I would like to see more people be able to realize their own potential, but also become activators themselves. So those are some of the things I look for. Um, but I don't know. I mean, other people might not feel this way, but I have a lot of faith that we can identify more roads towards anti racist work in particular. And I can't tell you what the exact vision for that will look like in the end, but we need to be developing those pathways and making people feel like, okay, you're invited to come walk this pathway with us, you know, and bring people together that way. That's important too.
Wow. So much that you talked about, and so much that you um so many visions that I can see that you have for our community, and I'm hoping to be a part of it if I'm still around. But I guess what I want to say is, do you have words of encouragement for people who are deaf, or for our community in itself? How would you encourage them to continue in the fight?
Well, no, first of all, the first thing that I would say is that if somebody tells me, well, I wish this thing could happen, or I wish somebody would do this about this problem, and the first question I have is, why not you? Go out there and do it. You know, half the time I think a lot of people sit around waiting for permission to make change. They think that maybe somebody else would be better at it, or somebody else has more knowledge about it, or nobody cares what they think. But the truth is that you can make people care about what you think. And the first step is go out there and do it. You know, and so many times, Shui, I've noticed that you know it just takes a little bit to push people over the edge. You know, they know something needs to be done. They have an idea of what it should be. They have an idea of who to talk to. They just need somebody to say, go. And so the main thing that I would say to encourage deaf people or hard of hearing people or people with any kinds of disabilities, first thing I would say is go, because you can. You know, there's an entire community waiting to work with you. You know, there's so many people who are allies that want to work with folks with disabilities. I think if people just try and also treat people well, the process, you can't be a jerk, very important. Treat people well, try, try to bring folks together. Like, you can do this. So, yes, my main word of encouragement is go.
Thank you, Amber. And I want to thank you and thank the interpreter who's here today interpreting for us. Um, I was speaking to her when she got here, and I'm thankful that she is here, and that she's gonna charge me for this interview. Um, thank thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day. I don't want to take too much of your time. It's 2:25 right now, so thank you so much for allowing me to do this. And I'll be reaching out to some of the community organizers if you don't mind.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. That's totally fine. And I'm kind of surprised that we're only at 2:25. I thought we would be here like all day, but that's totally 100% okay. Good luck with the rest of this project. Sounds like you're interviewing some really great people.
Yeah, I wanted to do this a couple years ago,
Oh, really?
but it never took off. It never went nowhere. And then the pandemic here hit, and so I can't go out. They can't go out unless they're working. So I figured this is the perfect time to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it works out great, and especially now that everybody is a lot more familiar with the kind of technology you need, you don't have to spend a lot of time training people on how to do it because a lot of folks know how. So it seems like, yeah, the right time for this project. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Let me stop this. Uh,
Stop recording, Sheree. Okay.